Well, it's 5 minutes past 6 by my watch. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Oliver Dodd, a lecturer in international relations at Liverpool John Moores University and a co-director for the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. It's my pleasure to chair tonight's CSSGJ 2025 annual lecture, Gaza and the Demise of International Law and Order. Thank you all for coming. Our speaker tonight is someone who needs no introduction, but he certainly deserves one. Tariq Ali is one of the most influential radical public intellectuals of the past 50 years. He is a writer, historian, novelist, filmmaker, and long-standing critic of imperialism and war. His body of work is extensive. A few highlights include The Islam Quintet, a series of acclaimed novels on the intertwined histories of Islam and the West, Bush in Babylon, the recolonization of Iraq, The Clash of Fundamentalisms, Crusades, Jihads, and Modernity, The Obama Syndrome, Surrender at Home, War Abroad, and most recently, his memoir, You Can't Please All. His work has been widely translated, and his commentary has shaped debates from Vietnam to Palestine and way beyond. Far from being an armchair critic, Tariq has never confined himself to the sidelines. In 1967, while observing the trial of Che Guevara's comrade Rigues de Bray in Bolivia, he was detained by the military dictatorship and accused of being a Cuban guerrilla fighter. His response was, "If you torture me the whole night and I can speak Spanish in the morning, I'll be grateful to you for the rest of my life." That mix of defiance and wit has marked Tariq's entire career. Tonight, Tariq will address what is arguably the most defining political and moral crisis of our era, the genocide in Gaza, the collapse of the so-called rules-based international order, and the implications for international law. Tariq will speak for around 45 minutes. Feel free to submit questions at any point using the Q&A text box, and we'll follow with a Q&A in the second part of the talk. Tariq, it's an honor for us to host you. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'm very pleased to be with you all. And so let's start where we need to start, which is with the dire situation in the Middle East, especially in Palestine and Gaza, where genocide has been in motion now for 2 years, over 2 years. And the interesting thing about what is taking place is that the West, the Western world, the United States and the European Union, with Britain, of course, permanently attached to the United States, have justified and defended a genocide. That is what is going on, in effect. Everybody knows that without the help of the United States in particular, but also the Europeans to a lesser extent, much more so in terms of political and psychological support to the Israeli regime, have been decisive. Without the United States, there could not have been a war of this character against the Palestinians. Its aim was spelled out very clearly by Netanyahu and his apologists, both at home and in the West, which said their aim was effectively to end any notion of a Palestinian state. And the fact that they have been forced to accept that there will be a Palestinian state because of the terms related to the terms of the current ceasefire is neither here nor there. It means absolutely nothing. There is no ceasefire. This was yet another ploy by the Europeans and accepted by the Americans to show their citizens that we are doing something. Look, we've managed, or Trump has managed to push through a ceasefire. There is no ceasefire. There's never been a stop to the bombing and attacks on civilians in Gaza since the ceasefire was declared. There's been no opening of the borders so that food and medicines can easily reach the beleaguered people of this, what was described even before the genocide began as a large concentration camp under permanent Israeli surveillance. That is what Gaza was. Today it is a wreck. Now they've permitted some photographs and pictures to come out, but the media still doesn't tell the complete story. Why? Partially, many of them are not allowed to. I mean, the BBC is under very heavy control, and it's got a weak and supine leadership. The top people who run the BBC, who are incapable of defying either Trump or the British government, which keeps a very close eye on what is going on television. Universities have been put under pressure, both in the United States and Britain, and of course, worst of all in Germany, to try and avoid discussions of what is taking place in Palestine and to arrest people who continue to protest for one reason or another linked to that war. The German situation is, of course, the worst. I mean, Palestinians and non-Zionist Jewish people have been beaten up by the cops in Germany. The situation here is not all that much better. We have, as I speak, 6 political prisoners on hunger strike in British prisons. We have the removal of a judge who was considered too objective, and his replacement by 3 safer judges who they feel will do the business in the trial, the appeal, which has been made by the Palestinian organization, which has been banned. An organization, most of whose supporters are as old as I am, or slightly younger. Mainly old-age pensioners being dragged off their wheelchairs and under their tents and locked into prison and registered, and in some cases, the younger ones in particular, hence the hunger strikes, not being given a bail on these absurd charges. When they offer themselves for arrest, they are locked up. And this is not going to stop. I mean, this is going to carry on. But the question that arises immediately is, what price international war? What price international war crimes are being tolerated? What price is being paid for the judges of the International Court, Criminal Court, being threatened? One senior judge said in public, "We've been told that, watch your families if you go and play these games." I mean, crude gangster style threats are being made. So we have to ask, what is international law? What was international law? And therefore, I think it's best to be blunt. International law / Western civilization were always, I repeat, always, from the very beginning, a consequence of the rise of colonialism and imperialism, And these measures were always came into being when the European powers were conquering the Western Hemisphere. I mean, if you think about it, the description of what international law becomes was not related to the rights of the native and indigenous populations in South America. It was very much related to the needs of the Spanish conquerors. So international law meant that the Spanish conquerors had the right to take over any part of the country where there was resistance and do what they liked to those people resisting, in most cases kill them. And the reason for this, the reason that was devised for this, was that the indigenous people are preventing the flow of goods. Freedom, the word freedom was rarely used because it didn't exist anywhere, are preventing the flow of goods and people in South America, i.e. preventing, or rather resisting, the attempt of the conquerors to take over large parts and large swathes of the country. In Europe, it was the same. Effectively, the Grotius's so-called maxims were linked to the rise of Dutch colonization and Dutch imperialism. He first developed these so-called international laws to justify the capture, interesting by the way, of a ship containing lots of goods and loot. And his statement was, Grotius' statement was, the title of it was On Booty, i.e. looting on the seas, saying that effectively Dutch companies and the Dutch state had the right to attack and take over any ship that they wanted to because they were the stronger and tougher power, and they were doing it to benefit the world. And this process has carried on and on and on from the 16th century onwards. There is nowhere where these laws came into being without being instrumentalized by Western colonialism and imperialism. And there is a great deal of proof. So what we see in the world is a continuation of the Cold War policies. During the Cold War, which dominated most of the 20th century, the line was that the word capitalism, by the way, was very rarely used. Instead of it, they substituted another word called freedom. And freedom meant having the same rights to elections, parties, free press that the West had at the time. And all those who didn't have this system were targeted in various ways, sometimes openly. It was what it was a counter-revolutionary assault on anything that challenged the right of empire to take over countries or dominate countries or control, manipulate countries that they wished to do. And we had, therefore, the huge revolution it's a hugely popular revolution in China in 1949, in Cuba in 1959, which opened up these continents to revolutionary movements, which were regarded as the enemy. They had no right to resist, even though some international laws later conceded that occupied countries had the right to resist, which was difficult not to concede after the Second World War, when the resistance movements were very active in parts of Europe against the Third Reich. But that was conceded with great difficulty, and they've already been trying to put it back. But effectively, what international law consists of is an attempt to bully countries that they don't like, or countries that don't kowtow to them, countries that don't bow to them. And in this situation, we see it at its most visible in Gaza. I mean, the live streaming of this genocide. Every day people can see it, citizens can see it. Now, I don't want to say that the citizens of Europe are ignoring it. They aren't. A majority of even German citizens are against giving aid to Israel because of the genocide, ignored by all the political parties. Italy is the same. Recently, Italy became the first country in Europe which called a general strike in defense of the Palestinian, with the dockers at Genoa in the lead of this, and a movement spreading to all the port towns. In Greece, ordinary citizens have marked and refused to allow Israeli tourists to unload on some islands and in some areas, and confronted them. And the conversations recorded between the incoming tourists and the citizens of Greece in themselves would make a very interesting, provide us with a very interesting survey of what most European citizens think and what most Israeli tourist citizens, many of them IDF people, sent to relax, given what they've been made to do. It's not the case that the citizens of Europe are basically in favor of it. A large majority aren't. And the same, absolutely the same, goes for the rest of the world. I mean, the people are shocked. There have been demonstrations everywhere. But what has happened is that the governments of these states, where the populations are opposed, the right of their own populations to oppose this ugly, brutal genocide are denied. Now they're being denied by large-scale repression and arrests, particularly in Germany, in France, and of course the United States of America, where an attempt to keep people off the streets, the creation of a sort of really an SS-type anti-immigration state-directed force to go and drag people out on the streets, followed the big attacks on the student encampments on universities in most parts of the United States. So the attempt is now how to turn our own citizens around so they either shut up or learn to support the genocide. This is effectively what the European powers and the North Americans are engaged in. There's no question of the defense of human rights. Anything like that. How could there be when they're arming Israel and defending the right of the United States and the European states, with sort of noble exceptions like Spain and Ireland, to name two. But by and large, the European Union is solidly behind this. And this is, I think, a blow, a self-inflicted blow, from which the systems that have been in place since the Second World War will go deeper and deeper into crisis and may not be able to pull out of it, because this is linked, for instance, to the economic crisis that erupted after the Wall Street crash of 2008, which showed the incapacity and the inability of capitalism to reform itself, to do things that even some of the bankers wanted in the United States. For their own sakes, they said, we don't want this to happen again. We should be punished. Obama, who was then in charge, said no. Share a glass of champagne at the White House and don't do naughty things again, and that was that. So because capitalism didn't feel threatened by any non-capitalist force, globally they carried on like before. And that has now created an untenable political situation with the rise of an insurgent far right all over South America, where it is, it will triumph in Chile probably at the next round. It's triumphed in Argentina. It's triumphed in Bolivia. I say triumphed because the United States has now turned its attention to South America again, since they've believed that they've sorted out the Middle Eastern problem. Just one other remark on the Middle East is that this could not have happened, obviously without the support of the US and Europe, but to this collection, we have to add the Arab regimes in the region. They have basically, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, to name the two most important countries, accepted the genocide, couldn't give any help whatsoever to the Palestinians. The Egyptians didn't even have the guts to insist that come hell or high water they would deliver food. And if the Israelis wanted to declare war on them for delivering food to the starving Palestinian masses, so be it. They'd have got a huge support from within the Arab world, but they didn't do it. Tunisia didn't do it. Morocco didn't do it. So even in the Maghreb region, the regimes were no different, I would say, from the Europeans backing Trump. This ceasefire that's been handed to them is a joke, and they know it. The big plan is to, make sure that Saudi Arabia and Israel don't fight, and so there's lots of pressure on recognition, peace pacts, and the like. But the Israelis are so out of control, so triumphalist, that they don't care a damn. So, peace negotiations supposedly are taking place in Qatar. And they go and bomb Qatar and say, oh, we were not targeting Qatar, we were targeting the Hamas leaders gathered there. Well, the Hamas leaders gathered in Qatar because the Americans asked them to. So this ability of Israel to ignore U.S. interests, we've always known, but in the past, U.S. presidents have rapped them on the knuckles and told them to behave or else. Now there is no longer or else, so far. And it's obvious that many of the things the Israelis have done are not in the long-term interests of the United States as the most powerful imperialist state in the world. So it's something that is, we're not going to, and the West is certainly not going to see the last of. No one believes them anymore, including their own citizens. In the Middle East, in South America, the other region where there's been turmoil over the last decades, all the attempts of the pink tide have failed. We have Scheinbaum in Mexico and Petrel in Colombia, but by and large, the Brazilian PT is in serious trouble. And the right has won Argentina with the support of American billionaires. Chile is going to go over to the insurgent far right again. Chile, which suffered the most vicious and brutal coup d'etat of the 20th century, with the backing of the United States. So it's not a situation where one can be or one should be optimistic. Obviously, one should expose an attack. but above all, the failure of all the institutions put in place after the Second World War stares us now in the face. There's some very brave and good people in the United Nations and its various departments, but they are powerless. Effectively, the structures of the United Nations are such that the majority, overwhelming majority of countries have no say at all. We are at a post-World War II structural situation, if you like, where the big powers who emerged after the victory against the Nazis in Europe are still running the country. I mean, there's quite honestly, if you look at the structure of the United Nations Security Council, there's the US, of course, has to be. Russia, China, yes, understood. And Britain, why? Why Britain? Why not Germany? I mean, that is the single most important country in Europe, as people will find out fairly soon. But they should be there. Why no Japanese? Or South Africa. So it's just completely, it's past its sell-by date, the United Nations. And it's used. I mean, I'll never forget Bush saying before the invasion of Iraq, if we get UN support, fine, we'll fly that flag. If we don't get it, fine, we can set up, a coalition. And if there's opposition in Europe to the war, we'll go it alone. I mean, it's perfectly true. People were shocked. Oh God, how can we go without the United Nations? And it's a weakness on the liberal left to say that the implication is that if somehow they'd managed to get the UN Security Council to agree with the invasion of Iraq, that would have been fine. Now people are beginning to realize that not all is well with these institutions that were created. What human right body, most of which have attacked the genocide, can say to the West, go and attack this country because they are in breach of human rights laws or whatever? How can you say to the West, which failed to move in the case of the genocide in Gaza, go and invade another country? But many people do it nonetheless. Quite a few serious people have been arguing, yes, let's topple Maduro in Venezuela. Why? Trump gave the most cogent explanation for why. He said they're rich, they've got the largest oil deposits in the world, and they're keeping them from us. Well, true. That's absolutely true. And that actually is very much in line with what Grotius and other early theorists of war and peace wrote in the past. It's in our interests, and we'll do it. That is US policy, the latest policy document, more or less spells that out. And we have to therefore say, and it's difficult to say because you do need some norms, but there are no norms in the world that apply to anyone. These are norms that apply only to regimes which have to be punished for whatever reason. They do not apply to regimes that are either carrying out the instructions of the West or have dragged the West with them to fight these wars together, as is happening with Israel. I mean, the International Criminal Court has decided that Netanyahu is a war criminal who needs to be questioned. They haven't said anything else. He needs to be questioned and have asked that he be arrested. Has Britain agreed to arrest him and other criminals associated with this regime? No, they won't do it. And we have a prime minister who was once DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions, where he learned his, the art of covering up unfortunate developments where he couldn't proceed to sue people because it would offend A, B, or C. So the whole British system has been corrupted by the genocide taking place in Gaza. The attacks on universities, the refusal to allow meetings to take place. Now the BBC journalists are told they have to go through a training course where they cannot be critical of Zionism at all. I mean, all my Jewish friends have fought all their lives against equating Zionism and Judaism. Now it's being told you have to do it. And if you don't do it, the state concerned will punish you. This is Britain under a Labour government. Labour governments have done horrible things before. I mean, even Trump had to get rid of Blair from a proposed sort of peace, so-called post-ceasefire peace thing, because Blair wanted a cut of the buildings that would be built and all that. I mean, grotesque figure, still being taken seriously by the British media and by the Labour Party. Blair's own spin doctor, Peter Mandelson, engaging, publicly and openly with pedophile assaults on children. Illegal. Appointed ambassador to the United States, then had to be removed. He runs Blair's office still through that slightly creepy figure who organizes all the purges and the expulsions and who the media are a bit scared of. These are the people still in charge, ruling this country. So now we have a related question, China. Because China has done something that no one expected it to do in such a short space of time, two or three decades. The comparison with the development is very interesting. To give you a very simple figure which shows what's going on, the US builds 5 ships a year. China builds 5 ships a day. That's the contrast. It is overtaking the West and the United States on many, many different levels. It has shifted the world market eastwards. China is the center of the world market, as Britain once used to be in the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. That position is now occupied by China, and there is a great deal of nervousness, because this is not just something you read about, you can see it. I mean, the astonishing rise of new cities, the creation of new cities, the architecture used to expand Shanghai also bears in mind social aspects. China is, for all purposes, a capitalist country, but it's a strange sort of state capitalism which is controlled by the Communist Party. You can pull out whenever they want. And so far, purely in terms of running capitalism, they've done a pretty astonishing job. That the West is no longer where it was. The Europeans in particular find it very difficult to relate to China. The United States is nervous. Let me And I say this because this is bringing up the question of rights once again. This is Paul Krugman in the New York Times on the 14th of November 2024. Krugman is a Democrat. He got the Nobel Prize for Economics. He has a regular column in the New York Times, and he's very nervous. And what does he say? China is an autocracy that doesn't share democratic values. Allowing it to dominate crucial industries is an unacceptable risk. So here we go again, this time on a global scale. If China is an unacceptable risk, this supposedly progressive Democrat columnist is effectively arguing for war. Well, how else do you crush China? And a section of the American ruling elite, ruling class, clearly would be in favor of that. But here's the problem, that China has also expanded technologically and has the capacity of fighting back. So it would be a crazed US government that provoked a third world war, because that's what it would be. The first thing the Chinese would do is crush the American presence in South Korea. Secondly, to take Japan, target it, change the balance of forces in the region completely, and then say to the Americans, well, what do you want? Do you want to carry on? It's a crazy idea. But the fact that they're saying it shows how desperate they are. And the fact that they're using democracy, human rights, no one cares now. No one believes you. No one accepts that that's what the motives are. Is Israel a democracy or an occupying force, a colonial force in the region? But forget Israel. We all know what that country has become. Look at Saudi Arabia. What are its democratic values? What are the democratic values of most of South America, where you're trying to recreate what you created first during the military dictatorship years, except doing it this time via bogus elections and so-called mass uprisings? So that is not going to work as effectively. Krugman and others should know that. If they want to wage war on China, then Trump will probably, he says he's completely opposed to it, which he may be at the moment. But if they decide to go down that route, no one is going to believe that the cause of war was democracy and human rights. How could it be? Just as a passing remark, I was once in Texas giving a lecture on the Iraq War, and my hostess from the anti-war group locally in Houston came and said to me, she picked me up from the airport, she said, you got 2 meetings. The one tonight is packed out, booked up, but I have to tell you this, I don't think there'll be a single person at this meeting tonight who won't be a millionaire or a billionaire. So I said, well, I'll try and manage somehow or the other, don't worry. I am used to talking to people of all sorts. So I did give my usual address on Iraq, and later that night a few of them had thrown a very closed dinner for me and were talking quite openly. And a billionaire, an oil billionaire, who quite a lot of them, by the way, were opposed to the war. They thought it was crazy. But over dinner that night, one of them said to me, hey there, Tariq, tell me one thing. Does China have any democracy at all? I said no, not in the form you're used to. Or no, it doesn't. But yet he said they've created the most thriving capitalism we've seen for a very long time and are doing very well. Is that not the case? I said that certainly is the case. And what it proves is that unlike the years of propaganda that capitalism can only flourish under a democratic regime, the Chinese have proved that this is not true. So he nodded sagely. He said, then tell me, why do we bother with political parties and trade unions? Let's mimic the Chinese. I said, you go ahead and do that. And we all laughed. But I think quite a lot of them in the US and elsewhere would be quite happy to give up democracy except on a token level in order to save their skins. And the only people who've defended democracy in the past and helped to create it are the people from below, both in the US, the Civil War especially, but also in Europe, where there were huge mass movements for democratic rights and creating the notion that this was handed up from above by some capitalist lords is grotesque to even think about it. And I certainly, I mean, if you see what's been happening in European capitalist democracies, or bourgeois democracies, as we used to call them in better times, is a total agreement between the center-left and the center-right, a thing I have described, a process I've described as an extreme center. And now we have huge far-right insurgencies to the right of the extreme center, because the extreme center has not been able to satisfy what people want and what they need in this situation and crisis. And what they demand and what they need are basic goods, basic things, which were promised in Jeremy Corbyn's manifesto when he was, before they totally sabotaged him, his colleagues. And it's a little bit of social democracy. That's all they're asking for. And even that is not acceptable. So Labour and Tory, no big difference. Tories collapsing, being taken over by Reform ahead of Labour in Britain, and similar processes taking place in Germany. In Italy, you actually have the far right in power. In France, Marine Le Pen, the however you want to describe her, the far-right leader, is well ahead of Macron. The big mass right-wing currents. Sorry about that. So that is basically what is going on, and the picture isn't good. And I'll end now by saying the only way, even in bad situations, the only way we can work is to be active and fight against this as best we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Tariq. That was excellent. And it leaves us a good amount of time for the Q&A. We've still got a good 40 minutes for the Q&A, so that was perfectly timed.
I'm just sorry.
No worries, my friend.
I'm sorry I'm in the middle of a Zoom conference. We'll ring later. Yeah.
We've got a few questions in the Q&A box already. If I encourage other people to submit any questions they have, and we'll go through them slowly. The first question I have from Kevin Nelson: the extreme centre 10 years on, given the collapse of left populism in Europe, reversals in Latin America, etc., does the global Palestinian solidarity movement offer new hope of sustained resistance to imperialism?
Well, as is known, I'm a staunch supporter of the Palestinian solidarity movements in all the forms and shapes it's taken up, uh, including Palestine Action against genocide and its occupation of, not occupation, but protestation against factories supplying goods for this cruel genocide that is taking place. So yes, this has been the big hope, but it's a hope related to a single issue. And it's not something so far that has expanded into other spheres of life. It could do, and to a certain extent it has done with the BDS campaign. But it can't be a substitute for a anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist political force that agitates and fights all the time, and not just for Palestine, but for other issues as well, and tries and gets representatives in parliament or whatever. So while the Palestine solidarity movement has been incredible, particularly in Britain, because we had created a Stop the War movement as long ago as 2001 against the war in Afghanistan, later against the war in Iraq. So we had actually begun to create a new consciousness. And they thought they could get rid of it in the case of Palestine by lies, by propaganda, by accusing people of anti-Semitism, by punishing individuals and institutions. And they haven't succeeded. And more people are coming out against what is happening in Palestine, despite this totally bogus ceasefire which people are meant to believe in. So yeah, they've played a big role.
That's great. We'll move on to, we've got a couple of questions more, Tariq, back from Mizzy. Thank you for your great talk. I was wondering if you could reflect on two issues. First, how do you understand the tension between the Marxist aspiration to transcend or abolish the nation state and the immediate urgent demand for Palestinian statehood and autonomy as a path toward liberation? Second, could you comment on the relationship between capitalism and crisis? One might argue that capitalism is not simply threatened by crises, but often recognizes itself through them, even thriving on moments of disruption.
Yeah, well, to answer this question, I'd need another 45 minutes, so forgive me for being brief. But yeah, it certainly is the case, as you say, that capitalism recognizes these crises and tries to work through them and fails. I mean, that's the one feature, is that capitalism, traditional capitalism in the US and Western Europe, is not working. It's not working in South America either. The only country where it's working is China, Vietnam, and that part of the world, South Korea to a certain extent. So the European version of it is collapsing. The South American version is not doing well. They're heavily dependent on the United States. And on the United States, Trump's ratings, despite all his, bragging, are going down because he hasn't delivered too much in concrete terms. So this is all true, but this will only be of benefit for our side, if you like, if something emerges, political force, political movements emerge which can challenge this. And every time there is a defeat, the movement settles down, people move on, they don't move on, they think. It takes at least another decade to recover, if there is going to be a recovery. And so often there is. No one thought in the early days of the pink tide in South America that there could be such a rapid recovery, and Chavez could actually make Bolivar into a modern figure. And Bolivarianism began to be talked out. Who would have thought that? I mean, Bolivar himself, used to say that trying to unite South America is like plowing the sea. It's like plowing the sea. We can't do it too easily. So that's, was there a part of the question I missed? It'd be so much easier if the questions came up here, actually, then I could keep them all in mind. Is that possible?
Yes, they should be coming up in the answered section, Tariq, of the question. So a few of them in the answered question and the open section, if that helps. Just on the bottom of the screen.
Uh, um, is this Graham McPhee?
Yes, shall we ask that question? Tariq, thank you for your insightful talk, but you seem to be collapsing law entirely into capitalist pragmatics. But then you seem later to suggest that law or norm should be applicable to US, Israel, and Western nation. There must be something more to law than just self-capitalist justification if we want now to appeal to it. Don't we need to critically extend law both internationally and democratically rather than disparaging it? Isn't it disparagement what Trump, Netanyahu, and Starmer are doing?
No,
Question.
they're not just disparaging it, they're using it. I mean, they've done this always. And the grabbing of booty, far from being a capitalist pragmatic, was an earlier, it's a sort of 18th century suggestion that this is all fine. I mean, the point I was making was that from the very beginning, there has been no such thing as a norm that is applicable to everyone. That the first place where this was tried out was in the Western Hemisphere by the Spanish in South America and by the Protestants and Puritans in North America, that their theorists have argued in favor of this. I mean, if you want, look at it and see what they did. Hobbes argued that where countries were not so well populated, and all the land had to be worked, as in North America, it was perfectly right to restrict the indigenous people to tiny bits of land, i.e. the reservations policy, which is exactly what Israel says in Palestine today. So these laws and their theorists were working very clearly. Now, does it mean we're in favor of democratic rights? We certainly are. We're in favor of elections, the most democratic form of elections, yeah. And we've had two experiences of those, the Paris Commune, where the elections were very, very widespread in the 19th century, in the early days of the February Revolution in 1917 and the October Revolution, the emergence of Soviets as workers' councils, where directly elected representatives were allowed a chance and, could dominate and vote on things. So I remain in favor of that. All I'm saying is that one should not have any illusions about these existing things. If you look at how votes go at the UN, for instance, could they go better? I think on some issues, if they'd abolished the Security Council and allowed every state a vote, you could get a big vote in favor of recognition of the US ending the sanctions against Cuba. But I will then pose immediately another question. What happens if the world passes this, which it does at General Assembly meetings? Only Israel, the United States, Papua and New Guinea, and now a few sort of Eastern European puppets vote against lifting sanctions on Cuba. But the question is, who's going to implement it? Who? There's going to be a world army created to go and invade the US, force them to stop. It's just a complete joke. So I think criticizing these institutions is absolutely vital, because if you don't criticize them and you don't see them for what they are, you have illusions in them. And it's these illusions which have affected large groups of the left. I mean, I remember arguing with Michael Foot, once about the United Nations, where I referred to the Secretary General of the United Nations as mealy-mouthed, and he went berserk at just that criticism. I don't need to do it too much because they're discrediting themselves effectively. They can't do anything about the United States and Israel. So what does the International Court of Justice become? What it has usually been, or the tribunal, The Hague. What it has usually been, an instrument of the world's most dominant powers. That is a fact.
We've got another chat, another question from Charlie Cooper. Thanks for that great analysis, Tariq. I agree we need to be active against the rise of the far right. What form of activism do you think this should take?
Well, obviously the far right is becoming a major force, using the tactics from the 60s and the 70s, because we were so dominant in those days, are not going to work. I mean, when Robinson can have, I don't know, 250,000 people in Whitehall, a civil war type pitched battle isn't going to help anyone, and the left will probably be defeated anyway. I think the only serious way, obviously you demonstrate against them and all that goes without saying, but the only serious way is to prepare and offer people who are being attracted to this sort of stuff an alternative. And I'll give you, recently in New York, in the elections for the new mayor, he's a very interesting guy. He's, calls himself a democratic socialist. But I was more interested in the tactics they used to defeat the right and far right. Mayor and the other guy standing again. He said we went into all the areas where people had voted for Trump. And we fixed up regular campaigning in those areas, knocking on doors and talking to people and saying, you voted Trump. Why? Tell me, let's talk. So it proved to be quite effective, because with the opposition of the entire New York media, the New York Times didn't think it was a good idea electing this guy who's the official Democrat candidate. Trump said he'd destroy him. Others said similar things. He won by quite a sizable vote. But it was linked to the fact that he could convince people. And I think the left and your party and the Greens and others have to find ways of doing this, and then you have to offer what the possibilities are, what can be achieved, what is not utopian, what is something that could be done. I mean, the woman who was elected the mayor of Seattle in the United States not so long ago, a few weeks ago, she said we argued very strongly at grassroots level, because there's a huge rent and housing problem, both in New York and Seattle, that we follow the example of the Viennese Socialist Party in the 30s. Actually hire people to build cheap, affordable homes, which can be rented at very low prices as long as, while the people who rent them are alive. And sort of quite creative ideas. And I think it's that sort of campaigning and demanding that we need, instead of sort of coming up with obvious cliches or utopian stuff which doesn't work. I mean, we can't compete with the right on their grounds that they're, kick out the immigrants, kick out the blacks or whatever they can. How can we compete with that? How can we accept that? Labour is doing it, but they will become a cropper, because when you go and fight the battle in a battlefield that has been prepared by someone else, it's very, very rare that you can win on that.
We've got a question here from our fellow panelist, Andreas Bieler, who asks, how would you respond to the claim that China is socialism in the making? This kind of argument that Vijay Prashad puts forward. Can China really provide a progressive alternative?
Not the way it is organized at the moment, because there are also, China, look, if we're totally objective, has achieved miracles in terms of its economic development. There's no way around it. It has done so by completely reforming the countryside to a large extent, and also the Chinese working class. And if you go into China today, we've just had a manuscript sent to Verso Books, in which it is effectively the oral history of graduates in China, okay? Not peasants, but graduates. And the author who did it, who speaks Mandarin and recorded them, says they're sitting around in their towns and having a discussion which we could be having in Hackney. The problems are the same for many of them. That means a big development. Then there is a very brutal attitude to the working class, and the use of workers from one part of China to come into places where they have no roots at all. So capitalism hasn't been achieved in China at this rate without any costs. As to whether this is taking us to socialism, I rather doubt it myself. I think they've gone so far down the road that I would like that to be the case, but I don't think it's going to be. I think to get back, or not back, but move forward to some form of socialism would require a huge upheaval within the party, within the army, and on the streets. That may happen, it may not happen. It's certainly not going to be an automatic transition to that. I don't agree with Vijay on this and on others who sort of got carried away. Effectively, there's nothing like that on the cards as far as I can see.
Thanks for that, Tariq. We've got a question from Kaham Zeb. The Western hypocrisy that was seen in the Palestinian conflict as they went against the very same ideals and international law that they established after the Second World War. Do you see the collapse of the current world order and the emergence of a new one? If so, what will be its shape, and in what ways will it be different from the current one?
I think it'll probably be different in the following sense. If you see what's going on in Ukraine. What is going on in Ukraine is a threefold affair. One, that the United States continuously, after the collapse of communism and the coming down of the Berlin Wall, had made promises which Gorbachev, in my opinion, was very foolish not to have written into treaty form, saying that they were not going to spread NATO to Eastern Europe, leave alone reaching the borders of the Soviet Union. The Russians took it. Finally, the CIA chief in Moscow went back, William Burns, and told the establishment and the CIA and the Pentagon. This is a red line if we drag the Ukraine into NATO. Don't do it. Don't do it. But they did because they were overconfident and thought Putin didn't mean it. So having provoked him, he did it. He got provoked and occupied it. And of course, one is sympathetic to the initial Ukrainian thrust to defend themselves against this attack, which the Ukrainian people didn't deserve. But the American toppling of the Ukrainian regime in 2014 and replacing it with a totally puppet-style regime, that was the first big signal that they were determined to go ahead. And Putin has more or less said that. So, okay, this is a disaster story from every point of view. The NATO High Command, with the initial backing of the United States, says we have to take on Russia. There's a lot of war talk. Pathetic British cabinet ministers and shadow cabinet ministers saying we can destroy the Russians, and this sort of nonsense. No attempt to explain to their people what the aims are. This has now created a huge crisis because the United States, under Trump, and probably under any US government, wants a deal. He wants to settle in the Ukraine, for which Ukraine will have to make some concessions, which even Biden said they would have to make had Putin accepted my plan, which is nonsense, but never mind. NATO is now on the brink. I mean, the US have used this crisis to tell the Europeans, fight your own fucking wars. I think Trump actually used that phrase on one occasion. And buy our arms. So they want it both ways. In order to fight the wars, you need more weaponry. The weaponry you have to buy from us. Now, this is not a proposal that is intended to stabilize the Western world. And how it will end, we will see. I mean, Germany, the single most important country in Europe, is now in the middle of a deep economic crisis because of this conflict and because they had to, as they saw it, break off all ties, not all, but a lot of ties with Russia, including having the pipeline transporting gas blown up by God knows which particular branch of NATO, the intelligence services. So the German economy is in a total mess, and that has already led to a huge rise of the right and far right in that country. If NATO breaks up, who knows? I mean, it's been an extremely aggressive outfit. If the Americans say they're not going to back it, it can't exist, in my opinion, because the Europeans don't have the strength to do it. So it is a very serious situation for the Western powers at the moment, and it is a crisis which shouldn't be underestimated. And front page photographs on the FT and the Guardian, etc., of Zelensky running to number 10 Downing Street and being welcomed by the French president and the German chancellor, just pure propaganda. Basically, something has to be done. The Europeans don't seem to be able to do it, and the Americans, for their own reasons, are trying to push through a negotiated settlement. And there's no doubt that they will earn a great deal of money for the military-industrial complex in the US were this to go through. So that, I think, is what is happening. It's a huge crisis. It's not being reported as regularly as it should, but if you read between the lines in the FT and other financial papers, you get an idea of how seriously they take it and think it is.
Thank you for that. We've still got a good 15 minutes to go, so feel free to ask more questions in the Q&A box. Please try to keep the questions concise. Tariq, you touched on Venezuela. We've got a question from Sinem Bal about Venezuela. To what extent is the genocide in Palestine and the current regime change in Venezuela connected?
I don't think they're connected in any real sense. I think what Trump says is correct from his point of view. I mean, we oppose it clearly. He says that the largest single oil deposits of the world are in Venezuela, and we want them. It's as straightforward as that. And the stupid Nobel Peace Prize Committee handing over the Nobel Peace Prize, the last Nobel Peace Prize, to this slightly crazed woman who pleads with the United States, come and invade my country. She has no support in Venezuela. On that, people are very critical of Maduro and the government. There's no doubt about that. But all the opinion polls carried out by US opinion poll organizations in Venezuela show that between 85 and 93% of the Venezuelan population is not in favor of a US invasion. And they're not crazy. They've seen what's happening in Gaza, what happened in Iraq. Their television networks show all this stuff. And this woman is parading around and even offering her Peace Prize to Trump, etc. So it's a grotesque situation if you think about it on every level, and it's not being reported. It's not being reported properly, but there are direct links. I think even if there hadn't been any genocide taking place in Palestine, the line of the hardcore, I mean, Rubio, his gang in the State Department, and others, is to try and get as much as they can. If they invade Venezuela, the question is this: how large will the resistance be, and how long can they fight? I don't think a majority, I haven't seen the figures of the people in the United States are in favor of this war either. I may be wrong. MAGA itself, the right-wing organization which backs Trump, is split because half of them said, we are not in favor of invading other countries, we're in favor of pulling out, and we haven't done that, and now you want to invade another country. So there is opposition at home also from the right, and obviously from this sort of insurgent movements and campaigns which are totally opposed to this invasion.
We've got a question in the chat from an anonymous attendee. Israel frequently behaves as a rogue state as opposed to upholding international laws, values, and norms. Besides Israel, are there any other nation states that act similar in character like Israel, but with some exceptions? One that comes to mind is the United States at the southern border between Mexico and the United States, for example.
Well, what is happening on the border between Mexico and the United States, to be fair, is not a genocide in that sense. It's a sort of anti-immigrants campaign to win votes and all that. I don't think one can quite compare it. As for international law, I mean, they could argue that international law doesn't permit illegal immigration. I'm just answering this in this way because it's very different from what is happening in Palestine at the hands of Israel. Another thing which comes close is the Israeli-backed United Arab Republic war in the Sudan, where there are many, many atrocities taking place because the regime in the United Arab Republic is keen to start behaving like Israel. That's the effect it's had on locals and its neighbors. And they're saying if Israel can do it to the Palestinians, instead of helping the Palestinians, saying we want to try and build our stock in the Sudan. So that is effectively what is taking place.
There's a question about witch hunts. How have you been affected personally as an intellect who has spoken out against the genocide against Palestinians? Have you been affected in any particular way?
Well, not really, because they had already started cutting down my appearances on Question Time or BBC Radio or whatever before the genocide, precisely because of my political positions. There was a big shift taking place. But so I am never invited to partake in a discussion on a radio show, which I used to do very often. And that's nothing compared to, I don't suffer from it, for God's sake. It hardly surprises me. So it's nothing compared to what is happening to many, many other people who are being sacked from their jobs, transferred, killed, and now these old age pensioners who are offering themselves for arrest to defend Palestine action against genocide. So no, it's nothing personal in my case.
There's one from Catherine. It will take a long time for the ICC to have an impact on criminal justice. Do you think it is still a worthy institution to have?
I think it is, but unless it is supported by the major Western powers, nothing too much will happen. So I'm not in favor of disregarding these institutions just like that. I'm saying, can they be used for the interests of people who are not in league with the Western powers or their puppet states in the Middle East or elsewhere? And I doubt it very much. Who's going to do it? China and Russia have been attacking the genocide. But China in particular, and I've argued this in public, is in a strong position to say to the Israelis, as long as you occupy Palestine and the Middle East, no trade relations at all, and no diplomatic relations. What does it cost them? Even if it costs them a bit, so what? That would set an example. That would create a new norm, which is, totally within China. They don't do that. Turkey is another example. The Turkish president Erdogan brays like a donkey about Gaza. But when it comes to concrete action, Turkey continues to arm the Israelis, continues to trade with them, continues to have diplomatic relations with them. If you believe in what you say, do it. Who's stopping you? The Americans will curse you and put pressure on you behind the scenes, but they can't stop you. So there are many, many problems on that front.
We've got 3 questions in the chat. One from Alistair.
Yeah.
In more traditional capitalist nations, large projects are developed without upfront state involvement, often leading to crises that require state rescue. China is more involved from the start. Is this significant?
Yeah, it is very significant. And I think the fact that the Chinese party and state maintain a virtually complete dominance over capitalism and private firms is not unimportant. And they've so far managed to avoid the big crises. For instance, the post-Wall Street crisis of 2008 didn't affect the Chinese too much. Trump's attacks on the tariff war, didn't the Chinese responded in kind because the Chinese state is capable when it wishes to defend its own interests in the way they do. So yeah, uh, it is.
Ian Hewitt, NATO must prepare for a scale of war our grandparents face. Mark Rutte, NATO chief, said today, is Gaza the future for us all, as Chris Hedges suggests? Is this a means to distract from climate breakdown?
I don't know whether it's a mean to distract from climate breakdown or anything else, but it is quite astonishing that Mark Rutte, who's a total nobody, can make a remark like this. I mean, these people who speak on behalf of NATO are joke figures. The only force that will determine the future of NATO and whether or not it wants it to go to war with Russia, which is the crazed idea of some of these Europeans, is the United States of America. Nothing can be done without it. And if people say, "Oh well, we had the war on Libya so many years ago," yeah, but the Americans were totally behind that. And Hillary Clinton actually arrived to celebrate the victory of the war and the public lynching of Gaddafi by the CIA. So it wasn't a European war. The Europeans, did the American bidding as usual. And I think the same thing applies in an even more serious way to Russia. I mean, does NATO actually think that it's going to maintain Ukraine as it is, leave alone induct it into NATO, without American support? And the Americans aren't giving that support. So far, they could change. But even if they change, let's say Putin refuses. He says, fine, you've broken every agreement in the past, etc., etc. Or are they going to attack? Are they going to send German and British troops together to defeat Russia? That, of course, if one looks back, is what the most astute members of the capitalist class wanted in the 30s. Effectively, a pact with Hitler to try and defeat the Soviet Union. And then they could all sit down and talk business, even the British Empire. But Hitler had his own ideas and, did a foolish thing, actually, strategically, which is to attack the Soviet Union. I mean, he was already too far stretched out. So my Russian friends who are all anti-Putin, they sometimes joke, we crushed the Third Reich in the Second World War. It was the Red Army in Stalingrad and Kursk that destroyed them as an armed force and their tanks and stuff. Maybe they now want revenge, but they also say, but we saved the British in the Second World War. Why do the British have to join with them now? Let the Germans try it on their own. Quite common, actually, to hear Russians talk like that, because they have a sense of history. Even Putin, who's a conservative figure, says, well, we shouldn't forget it was the Red Army that destroyed the Third Reich, and it would be bad if they now sought revenge against us. We're not the same people.
Well, last but not least, Tariq, we've got one final question in the chat, so it's well timed. Ottavio, considering the current scenario in Venezuela and the effects of the Trump administration to categorize criminal organizations in South America as terrorists, do you see in the near future us entering in another war on drugs as seen in previous administrations?
It could be, but Hugo Chavez predicted some decades ago that when they come for us, they'll try and use a drug excuse. We know how they are, we know how they operate, and we'll be prepared for them. So it's not that they don't know they're going to do this. As for these innocents they're killing in the Caribbean, on the sea, mean, that is a crime, and that actually has created some problems for the Trump administration because you open that up that we can kill whoever we like if we suspect them of being drug smugglers, etc. That could, any other state started doing that, it would create huge problems. So there's some, this is against their own interests. But of course, the Americans can do that. They sanction whoever they like. They declare anyone they don't like to be a terrorist. The Brits are doing it now against a local anti-war, anti-genocide organization. The Americans can do it globally and have done so in the past, but it's not necessarily going to end in success for them. And sometimes we see that powerful nations can be humiliated in quite serious ways by states which they disregard as being nothing states or joke states, etc.
Yeah, well, on that note, I think we'll finish. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you here as part of our annual lecture for the CSSGJ, Tariq. I found that, and I'm sure many others found that to be a very informative talk. We covered a huge amount of history, a lot of topics, and the Q&A was very fruitful and engaged as well. So thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to uploading it on YouTube, where many more will hopefully engage with this brilliant talk. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you very much, and the best of luck to all of you. Keep your jobs.
Happy festive
Thank
period,
you.
and we'll see you soon. All the best.
Okay, ciao.